This is the second part of the Autism and Attention mini-series. I will present the sticky attention theory and evidence for and against it. This theory originated from a study by Landry and Bryson demonstrating a striking failure to disengage attention in young children with autism. The abstract of the study captures the essence of the theory and findings. It says disengagement of attention in autism parallels that in normal 2-month-olds, in whom attention has been described as obligatory. The disengage problem in autism was striking, with 2 exceptions. The individual mean disengage latencies for children with autism all exceeded those of children in the other 2 groups, children with Down syndrome and typically developing children, by at least 1 standard deviation. Landry and Bryson reached this striking conclusion using a simple attention paradigm. In their study, children fixated on a visual stimulus presented at the center. Then another stimulus, a dynamic geometric pattern, appeared in the visual periphery, either to the left or to the right. Landry and Bryson measured the amount of time it took children to look toward the peripheral stimulus. To specifically examine sticky attention, Landry and Bryson tested children in 2 conditions. In the shift condition, the central stimulus disappeared as the peripheral stimulus appeared. So here, one can simply shift attention from the center to the periphery because there is nothing in the middle that's keeping attention there. In the disengage condition, the central stimulus remained visible while the peripheral stimulus was presented. Because the central stimulus stays on, it was necessary to first disengage attention from it before shifting attention to the periphery. Sticky attention, or the disengagement cost, was measured as the difference in saccade, or the latency of looking in the direction of the peripheral stimulus, between the disengage condition and the shift condition. The children with ASD in this study had relatively low IQ. The average IQ score was around 70. As you can see here, whereas their shift time was comparable to those of typically developing children and children with Down syndrome, children with autism showed a marked impairment in disengaging attention from the central stimulus. This difference was striking and compelling. It was further supported by subsequent baby sib studies. So these were studies that track baby siblings of children with autism, and found that they also showed slow disengagement of attention. In fact, those who showed more evidence of sticky attention was more likely to go on to develop autism themselves. However, there are a few issues that we should consider with regard to this particular study. The first one is when you look at the scale over here, this is known as the saccade latency. This is the amount of time it takes for someone to move their eyes from one position to the next. The latency here in adults, okay, if you examine an adult, the typical range is in the range of 200 to 300 milliseconds. Now, presumably children could be slower, but perhaps not 10 times as slow, okay? So this raises some issues about whether the measure here is a valid measure of disengagement. And second, this is a point that we raised earlier, that children in this study had relatively low IQ, on the average of 70, which is about 2 standard deviations below the mean. That's approximately 95 percentile and below. Okay. So similarly, in the baby SIB studies that was examined in the subsequent studies, these children also tend to have lower cognitive scores on a test known as the Mullen test. So this raises the question about whether sticky attention is a feature of autism spectrum disorder or whether it's a feature of general intellectual deficit. Now you might say, well, Down children also have a relatively low IQ, and yet they don't show the same pattern as children with autism. However, you can also see here that Down children, unlike typically developing children who do show a difference between shift and disengage conditions, Down children don't show that difference. So it's unclear if they are the right comparison group. So is sticky attention a general feature of autism dissociated from global intellectual delay? To address this question, my colleagues Jason Fisher Cami Coldwin and Nancy Canwisher and I set out to test a large group of children with autism spectrum disorder, matching them with typically developing children on age and gender. We capitalized on the fact that many children with ASD have normal IQ. Their social and communication deficits do not go hand in hand with global mental intellectual delay. In our sample, both groups had nonverbal IQs of around 110. We then repeated Landry and Bryson's main comparisons, but this time with an eye tracker rather than with video cameras. And this way we'll be able to produce a more precise measure of attentional disengagement. Now, because attentional disengagement may be influenced by the nature of stimuli, we also manipulated the type of stimuli at the center as well as the type of stimulus in the periphery. They can be either social or non-social. Here's a schematic illustration of the conditions. The object at the center could be either a face or a non-social stimulus like toys, fruits, and vegetables. And the new object in the periphery could also be a face or a non-social stimulus. So these factors were crossed over in an orthogonal manner, producing 4 conditions, okay? Starting with a non-social stimulus and moving to a non-social stimulus, starting with non-social, moving to a social stimulus, social to non-social, and social to social. And in addition, the central stimulus can either go away, okay, that's in the shift condition. When the peripheral stimulus shows up, the central stimulus goes away, or that it can stay on the display, which would require a disengagement from the central stimulus. Okay. So if sticky attention is a prominent feature of ASD, then children with ASD should show a larger disengagement cost. But if sticky attention is associated with relatively low IQ, then high-functioning children with ASD, those children with normal IQs, should not show a larger disengagement cost, even though these children have autism as demonstrated by diagnostic tools and by their impaired performance on tasks that involve theory of mind. Shown here are data from the neutral condition, which children disengage attention from a central non-social stimulus toward the peripheral non-social stimulus. The saccade latency was around 300 milliseconds, a reasonable range. Okay. Typically developing children showed a disengagement cost, okay, with longer saccade latency in the disengaged condition relative to the shift condition. This was also the case in children with autism, and in fact, the difference between disengage and shift was nearly identical between the 2 groups of children, providing no evidence for the sticky attention theory. An additional question that our study addressed is the impact of social stimuli on attentional orienting. Even in the camp of researchers who propose that social functioning is impaired in autism, substantial disagreement exists with regard to whether the social deficits are pervasive, affecting all aspects of information processing, or whether certain social functioning is preserved in autism. In our study, we examined saccade latency as a function of whether the peripheral stimulus was social or non-social. As can be seen here, typically developing children were substantially faster to saccade toward the face than toward a non-social stimulus. Okay? And interestingly, this was also the case in children with autism. These data show that at least some forms of social functioning is preserved in children with autism spectrum disorder. In particular, these children show preferential attentional orienting towards social stimuli, even though they may be impaired at more abstract aspects of social reasoning. These findings led me to cross out sticky attention as a general account of